If psychology and pop culture had a baby, they'd call it Shrink Tank.
There is a sort of pendulum that's swinging back and forth where we kind of go from one extreme.
And I think there's an element of truth to
Because
this.
I have something interesting later in the show that will make you feel very weird. From Nashville and Charlotte, this is the Shrink Tank Podcast. And welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Dave Verhagen here in Nashville. We have a fantastic show for you. Our trending topic today is the impact of liberal media bias. We'll talk about the Jussie Smollett scandal, the Covington High School lawsuit, all that kind of stuff in our second segment. But first, let's meet our Charlotte panel. Emma Kate Wright is sitting there in the Charlotte studio. Emma Kate, how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you.
I'm going to ask I'm doing fine. I'm going to ask a question that I didn't prep you for, and if you want to pass on it, you can.
Okay,
But
I'm ready.
A lot of times in our field, we don't really disclose where we land on a continuum politically, because we don't want to alienate people and that kind of thing. But since we do talk a lot about political issues, if you had to say, like, here is a continuum, it could be like a 5-point scale. If 3 is dead moderate and 5 is very liberal and 1 is very conservative, let's say that, okay? Where would you put yourself? And you can say pass if you want to.
I'd probably say I'm at 3.5. I think I lean more liberally in certain aspects, but I also have conservative viewpoints, especially when it comes to fiscal, economic areas. So I'd say I'm independent, but I really do sway a little bit more to the left. So that's where I'm at.
All right. And Dr. Frank Gaskell is out again today, and not a coincidence that he's out when we have to talk about the impact of bias. But I have no idea where Frank would say he is. I really do not have any idea. I think it depends on the day, on the minute.
Yeah,
True.
Seriously.
The minute.
Or whatever Howard Stern said that day.
True.
Right. Because sometimes I listen to him and I'm like, you're like an old conservative guy. And then sometimes I'm like, you're like a flaming liberal dude. Like, I don't know what it is. So
Unclear.
We'll have to ask him sometime. But Jonathan Hedderly's here. He's our certified Asian who rounds out the panel. Jonathan, same question. You can pass on it if you want to, but if you had that continuum, 1 very conservative, 5 very liberal, you'd put yourself about a what?
Well, I mean, I grew up in a very conservative home, and a lot of my family would probably identify themselves as fairly conservative. But I probably, over time, and then certainly having kids and becoming a parent, I'm probably right down the middle. Like, I think having a sort of a political or religious upbringing that was very defined and then challenging it in young adulthood and adulthood is kind of like, more than anything, I'm trying to avoid being so rigid and concrete as maybe a lot of things were when I was growing up. And so maybe the safest thing is to say right down the middle, because I try. I'm not by any way, shape, or form suggesting that I'm successful at it, but I try to see both sides, because I have a lot of family members, and then with my wife's family, where it's like we're going to have conversations and we are not an echo chamber. There's just too many people in my life that have differing political and religious opinions that if I was too rigid, I'm going to alienate a huge population of my family and loved ones.
I'd say the exact same thing. I'd say my early upbringing was much more conservative, and I found myself, if I had to give a number, I'd say a 3, but I'm kind of like what Emma Kate said in that I find myself leaning slightly left now, but I think it's just a reaction to the Trump stuff. Like, I feel like but then I kind of step back and say, I don't know that that's really truly conservative stuff. I think that's just Trump stuff. And so I find myself, if anything, leaning more on that sort of left side, but only in opposition to what I think is kind of nutty stuff on the other side. But yeah, I'd give myself a 3. So it's interesting. We're a bunch of moderates here.
I have to make a funny statement right now, because we're actually talking about bias on this episode, and yet we're all falling into a bias in this moment potentially, where we tend to view ourselves as less biased as others. That's a common issue where we individuals tend to rate themselves as being unbiased when the reality is we all have different biases.
May be true. It may
Fun
be
fact.
so.
Well,
Yeah,
thank
fun
you
fact.
for that, Emma Kate.
That may be true. I don't know. We will see as we talk. Well, each week Jonathan trolls around the internet and he finds a great story of psychology in the news for our first segment that we call
Being Human.
Normally, I'll bring to you guys a recent study or a finding in the field of psychology, but today I just wanted to bring up a celebrity that we're not going to spend our trending topic on. But Justin Bieber recently has been very vocal about his ongoing struggle with depression. The 25-year-old pop star has recently posted on his Instagram page asking for his fans to pray for him amid this really deep struggle with depression. Sources say the singer is in outpatient therapy. He's getting help every day. And this comes on the heels of an interview with Vogue that in February was published. And he opened up about his struggles, saying that at one point he was attending a week-long intensive group therapy retreat and adding that his mom was depressed a lot of his life. His dad had anger issues, and he's dealing with the stuff that he feels like was passed on to him. He's also been interviewed admitting that he used to abuse Xanax, and that anti-anxiety medication can definitely worsen depression if taken in the wrong dosage, or especially going through any type of withdrawal. So Emma Kate, what do you make of Justin Bieber using his social media platform to really not just inform people, but really asking for his fans and others for support and prayers?
I think it's wonderful. I think he comes from the generation where you are so used to engaging with others through social media that he's really using it as a means to help him cope. It seems like he's definitely leaning in on his faith to help him get through his issues right now. And I can't help but wonder about how much he probably has grown as an individual and into his adult life, because now he's married, and when you are in a relationship, it's not just you anymore, and so all of these issues start to come out, and I think he's handling this really as well as he can.
I think it's significant, and I think it's more significant than we realize, because we're used to, in the last decade, having celebrities come out and say, I have struggled with depression or anxiety or fill in the blank, and it is done in these sorts of almost past tense ways. Like, I have had this struggle and this is what I've done, and maybe I'm not all the way through it, but I'm at a good place, or I've learned how to cope, or that kind of thing. We've become kind of used to that, and that's a really good thing. It helps destigmatize mental illness and mental health struggles. Then we also have had a few, I won't name them, but other celebrities who've thrown things out there when they're just a mess, and not like I'm working on something, but just I'm falling apart. We've had that. This is something different, which is I'm in the middle of a struggle and I'm taking active steps in the middle of that struggle to get better. And I'm in therapy and I'm working on it. That is actually about as good a thing that we could have a celebrity do who's struggling with a mental health issue, is not to make it all wrapped up in a neat little bow, not to put it out there when it's sort of all raw and oozing out everywhere, and not moving toward anything that's healthy or good, but really where it's like it's using a platform to say, I am really struggling and I'm taking these steps, and I hope you'll join me in thinking about me, praying for me in that. That to me feels really good. I mean, I feel bad for him because I think he's probably got some pretty deep stuff to work out, but I do feel like I really commend the guy for that.
Yeah, and we hear a lot about celebrities that they wait until things get so dire that they have to drop everything and go away to treatment. And so the fact that he is taking a lot of either proactive or preventative measures, I think also that he has a very realistic outlook on his mental health, that this is something that you have to manage day to day, and there's highs and lows. So versus hopefully a quick fix, or just sort of point the finger at external circumstances that are going to change. But then the other is, in the midst of all that, he is stepping a little bit back from his celebrity And I think that's a great message that no matter how successful you are, no matter how much pressure may come with your success, you can't achieve anything, and you can't love the ones you love and be who you're meant to be if your mental health is deteriorating to the point where you can't even get out of bed, let alone think in a real rational manner.
And I think about this guy, he's saying, his mom has struggled with depression, his dad struggled with anger and emotional regulation problems. So there's probably, we would guess some biological piece of this, but also this guy has just had an extraordinarily different life than everybody else. He, from the time he was very early in his adolescence, was in the public eye. He was a megastar, not just a kind of a nominal or people knew his name, but like the highest wattage of star that you could be, and had times where right in the middle of when he's supposed to be forming his identity, he's under the influence of people that are going to make it easy for him to do all kinds of nutty things. And he did. And so you've got all this combination of like figuring himself out from an identity standpoint, dealing with, some maybe biological issues, and then also just the having to sort through what's happened in his life so far and where it is now. So it may be a road for him, but I just feel like I think this is a significant thing for him to put it out there in the middle of it, but not just in this sort of like, I'm struggling the end, but I'm struggling and I'm taking steps. It feels really good. If you have thoughts about this and you have any comments that you'd like to make, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you think. You can tweet us at shrink_tank or write us a great email, feedback@shrinktank.com. Or if you want to subscribe to our YouTube channel, now we have the video version of the podcast up on YouTube, and there's opportunity to make lots of comments. It drops after the Monday after this drops on Friday. So it'll be up on Monday, and you can go up there, make any comments that you want, good or bad. We'd love to hear from you. Let's shift gears to our trending topic. We're going to talk about the impact of liberal media bias, and we're going to talk about the psychology of liberal media. And so let's first of all give a little backdrop of why we're talking about this today. First, we had the Jussie Smollett scandal, which we didn't talk about in any detail here, where he had made an allegation. Then there were people coming out in his camp saying, we totally back Jussie. We're for him. Then he goes on interview, and it's sort of like, you're kind of a bad person if you doubt his story. And then it comes out that maybe there's reason to doubt, and then he's charged with felonies, actually. And so that's a biggie in terms of how the media responded to that, how the story was framed. Then we have the Covington High School kid who is suing a lot of media outlets for their coverage because they framed it up very quickly, at least in their view, as he's this smirking face of white privilege, when maybe there was more to the story when you saw the full video and you saw the whole thing unfold. And there are other stories like that are kind of revealing a bias in the media. Let's also say, I don't think that that's in much dispute. When they do surveys of journalists and people in media, for the most part, they tend to be more liberal in their politics and their point of view. So we want to talk about what all this means psychologically and in our current pop culture landscape. But let's just have an opening question for Emma Kate. Your thoughts about the impact of liberal media bias and where that is right now in our culture.
So this is a huge issue because we need to be able to trust the information that we're given. So when we think about the news, we have to have appropriate reporting of information. The news is where we have a call to action. And so we want our journalists to be able to shine a light in the dark spots that are needing to be addressed. Because if we don't know about it, then flawed systems, corruption, all of that's just going to stay the way it is until it's an even bigger issue. So we need our media to be accurately reporting information. And the lack of trust is really hard now because, and I'll admit personally that I have a hard time figuring out where to keep my attention. Well, that's normal, but in terms of, like just feeling overwhelmed by the amount of information that's out there now, and where do you spend your time, and then how much fact checking do we actually have to do now? Because I know if I really am intensely looking at something, I'm going to try to look at multiple sources, where in the past, I don't think that was ever an issue for people. You just got the news and that was truth. So it is absolutely having an effect on how people are receiving and accepting information.
Jonathan.
Yeah, when you think of these two examples you brought up, the Covington high school teens, Jussie Smollett, I'm at a point where I really don't know what to believe about. I just know that there was a rush to judgment. I think there was a blurring between media reporting and social media opinion and shaping the narrative. I feel like when I work with anxious clients, a lot of times we talk about how to decrease their anxiety to where they look for problems that aren't there so they can direct their attention to problems that are really there and they can do something about. And we know hate crimes and hate crimes, whether because of race or sexuality, we know that they're there. We know that is a problem. And if this turns out that this was a conspiracy and a hoax, it's a huge disappointment, shame, and travesty that has taken time and resources away to really pursue legitimate hate crimes. We know that there are bigoted or racist groups, even teenagers, and whether or not this was something that happened, whether or not there was a real kind of a conflict going on with the Covington High School or not. There's just a lot of hate out there, and for us to kind of try to frame something that maybe wasn't the case, I find really off-putting and worrisome.
So Emma Kate made this point at the top of the show that we were doing something that we were going to be talking about, which is maybe reflecting our own bias. We're all sitting here saying how moderate we are, how in the middle of the pack we are, and maybe we're not. Maybe we're more liberal than we think or conservative than we think. So I think what we know about bias is that a lot of times, most of the time, we're fairly unaware of it. We think we see things clearly when we don't. So let's assume that's true for everybody. Let's assume that most everyone's doing that they think they see it clearly. Like I think it's amusing that Fox News, its tagline is fair and balanced, right? It's like, do they really believe that that's fair and balanced? I hope not, but do they believe that? And yet, we've got on right and left people that have their own biases. Yet we still have to have news. We still have to have reporting. Like, how do we move past that, or how do we manage that if we know in surveys that the majority of journalists tend to be more liberal leaning, and the way that a lot of conservative folks has been is just get into the Fox News silo and not listen to anything else, because the perception is that anyone else or no one else can really portray things in a fair and balanced way. Any thoughts about how we get around or through this tendency for us all to have a bias?
I feel like acknowledging the fact that we all have a bias is the first step, honestly. Implicit bias is just such an undeniable thing. So implicit bias is essentially our attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, affects our actions, our decisions in this very unconscious way. And for us to be able to recognize that we are all biased in some capacity based on our upbringing, based on our life experiences, that to me is the first step. And even then, I feel like when journalists write a story about something, it almost doesn't make sense for them to not be biased to share more about that, or to convey the feeling or the emotion that goes behind it, because it gives it more context. And I guess part of it is I don't want to say bias is good in terms of bad information, but in some ways there is kind of this balance piece that we have to take into account. But our media is absolutely biased.
I mean, I think we've moved into a period, especially with 24-hour news cycles, especially with social media, all these different platforms for reporting things. There's the ratio of reporting that something happened versus editorializing and people giving specific opinions on the matter. And maybe maybe I'm just narrow-minded in thinking that has as much of an impact as others. But I think we've talked about this previously, that we're in a kind of an era of moral outrage in terms of reporting that. But in and of that self, that tends to signify that somebody has moral superiority over another. Dave, I think about I want to say moral psychologist that we've talked about before, Jonathan Haidt, in The Righteous Mind, and he talks about the 5 moral foundations. And then I think about groupthink, to where it's now you identify yourself in a group, and then anytime you try to dissent from that, that really puts you in the crossfire. So I think we're just in this really interesting period where critical thinking and taking issues individually versus your tribe and your group, you have to be uniformly conform to that thought and perspective.
Yeah, and I think the reality is we don't like hearing information that goes against our own beliefs. And there's an effect, I think we've talked about before, called the backfire effect, where when you receive information that is counter to a belief that you hold, it actually strengthens your belief. So I think that's what's happening, is that right now, we're having this divide become greater and greater because everybody's getting information to counter one perspective, and then it's just, how do we blend and how do we move back towards the center?
One of my favorite quotes, and I have heard it attributed to Nietzsche, but I'm not sure that it was from him, but it's a great quote. It's not the facts that convince us, but the disposition of our hearts. And if ever there was a time culturally, historically, where that's true, we're seeing that big time. So I think that's just what you guys are saying, is just acknowledging that we all have a predisposition or leaning and a filter, and not to think that we don't have a bias, and for the media to sort of acknowledge that as well, that they might be operating out of some bias. But let me push back in a different direction. One of the criticisms in this very polarized time has been that the media is not liberal enough, meaning they're not up to the challenge of pushing back hard enough on some of the craziness that's going on. That we don't have Watergate era journalists that are doggedly going after corruption and wrong practices and so on. Do you think that's valid, and how does that fit in this conversation?
I don't know what Heatherly thinks, but I completely see parts of that. When you consider just the market-based bias that is inherent with any business, you are going to be trying to create money off of a product. And for media, it's selling information, selling the news. And so, they're only going to report what they think their base is interested in hearing. And so, yeah, I think to an extent we might see parts of that.
Jonathan?
Well, you think about Watergate. That was, maybe this is a bias, but that was a very atypical, it's not everyday type of both event or reporting. But you think about in the last 15, 20 years, you've had the spotlight with the Catholic Church scandal of abuse in Boston area. And some of these things, maybe there is more cooperation with government, but just recently, the prostitution sting down in Florida with Robert Kraft, the owner of the New England Patriots. You have, is it Rowan Farrow?
Rowan Farrow.
And just all of the editorializing and investigative journalism he did with Harvey Weinstein. You have recently Ryan Adams in the New York Times piece that came out. You have the Robert Mueller investigation. These things don't happen every single day. Now, it may take a year or two or longer to look back and say, was that happening? And you finally see the summation of that deep dive in investigative journalism. But you can't unearth that in a substantial way overnight.
Right. And I think you're bringing up a good point that I want to add on to, is that when there is something that is truly going to rock the foundation of the country, like Watergate, I think regardless of your political affiliation or how you swing, you're going to want to hear about that. But at the same time, I think what happens, and there's research to back this up too, is if you were to switch the label of what news outlet you're getting it from, so the example I'm pulling from is a study that was with CNN or Fox, people will get the same information, but based on who they're getting it from, it shifts how they view it. And I think that's something that we also have to take into account. So not only is the media biased, but our perception and our reception of and taking in that information is biased.
Jimmy Kimmel does a great bit where he poses things to people and he says that Donald Trump says this or someone else said, depending on who it is and their own bias, they'll either agree with it or disagree, no matter how outrageous it is. So it does make that point. I actually think that criticism is not largely true. I actually think we've got some great journalism going on. The New York Times, Washington Post. Even if you look at Fox News, there are people like Brett Baer, Chris Wallace, Shepard Smith that are pushing back sometimes very hard. You've got Rachel Maddow, who's doing amazing work, Chris Cuomo, and others. So I actually think we're in a time of pretty sharp journalism and pretty sharp investigation. So I don't really think that's necessarily true, that they're not liberal enough. But I think our main point here is that people need to be aware that we all have biases and to check those, and also maybe to expose yourself to perspectives that are different than yours, just to kind of round that out. All right. If you have a thought about this, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you think. You can tweet us at shrink_tank, or you can write us at feedback@shrinktank.com. And also, if you want to check out our YouTube channel, we've got the video of this up on Monday, and we'd love to hear from you in the comments. And our final segment that we're going to do is called Doctor's Orders. These are things that we're personally enjoying in pop culture. And Emma Kate, you have a recommendation for us.
So I did not actually know about this, but HBO has a new documentary called The Inventor, Out for Blood. And it's the story of Elizabeth Holmes, who was the founder of Theranos, which is a company at its peak worth $9 billion. And she was promising this device that could diagnose 200 or more conditions through a pinprick to collect blood. And it was all a scam. So if you guys are interested in that sort of fun story that's not really fun, watch it.
I saw it this week, and I would recommend it, especially if you liked the Fire Festival documentaries. It's the same kind of idea. It's the same notion of like someone who decides they're going to do something and everyone else is saying it's impossible and you can't do it. And they just decide, I'm going to be Steve Jobs and I'm going to do it anyway. And they can't do it. And it ends up being not just undoable, but a flat out illegal scam. So it's definitely worth watching. Jonathan.
Two recommendations. One is Netflix has dropped the original film Triple Frontier, starring Ben Affleck and I'm already blanking.
Oscar Isaac. And
it's a really interesting. I think it's flawed, but it's a movie that's not quite action and it's not quite political commentary. It's a little bit of both, trying to explore really life as military after your service is ended and what you have to look forward to in that regard. So I would recommend people check that out. And then I've recommended this before, the podcast Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend. But recently it dropped an episode where it's him and Michelle Obama. He interviews her. And I think it's a really fantastic back and forth talking about kind of how she's shaped her public persona and focus out, once leaving the White House and the reasons why. I highly recommend you check it out. She talks a lot about the book that she recently published, the Michelle Obama episode of the podcast Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend.
And I have two recommendations also. One is another HBO documentary. It's actually a documentary series. If you saw or listened to the Serial podcast, the original one, this is really picking up that story. And it is the case against Adnan Syed. And it is very well done. Definitely recommended if you're interested in that particular story. It is really revisiting that murder case that happened back in 1999, I believe. And it is fascinating kind of assortment of characters too. And then also a recommendation that I've made before, but I just want to recommend it again because they come back from their mid-season hiatus. It's a show that normally I wouldn't think would be worth recommending. My wife actually introduced me to it, and it's SEAL Team on CBS. And if you're thinking it's just a CBS procedural, you're maybe a little bit, that's maybe true, but really it's not. The characters are pretty deep. The plots are really sometimes pretty complex. There's a lot of moral issues involved, a lot of kind of interpersonal stuff. I've just found it to be a really, really good show. I think it's the best show that people are not watching, and it's really on the bubble in terms of renewal. I don't think CBS is yet to make a decision about whether to renew it, so I just want to put good words out there about SEAL Team on CBS. And that's going to do it for this edition of the Shrink Tank Podcast. If you like this episode, we hope that you'll give us a good rating on iTunes and tell all your friends to subscribe as well. And for more content exploring the intersection of psychology and pop culture, we hope you'll visit shrinktank.com for great articles and videos, and also links to some of our Doctor's Orders products. You can follow us on Twitter at shrink_tank and like us on Facebook. And for questions or comments, we hope you'll drop us a note. Our email is feedback@shrinktank.com. Also check out our video version of this podcast on YouTube and subscribe to that as well. Our producer and theme music composer is Sean Beck. Our associate producer and social media guru is Mariel Butler. For Emma Kate Wright and Jonathan Hedderly in Charlotte, I'm Dave Verhagen in Nashville. Tell all your friends about us and make it a great week.
Shrink Tank.